Good evening. Welcome to the Hall of State, home of the Dallas Historical Society. My name is Carl Chow, and I'm the Executive Director for Dallas Historical Society, which we call DHS. For those that are not familiar with DHS, we've been in Dallas collecting Dallas and Texas history for the last 97 years. We have over 3 million items in our collection, some of you which you've seen upstairs tonight. We're also a research facility where people, when they're writing books, papers, movie scripts, they come down and do research at our facility because of our collection. We also have year-round programming. For those of you that aren't familiar with it, we have a brown bag lunch, which once a month, someone comes in here during lunch. They tell stories and people bring their lunch and it's free to the public. We have a monthly happy hour called Pour Yourself into History, where we'll go to an iconic bar or location in town where the proprietor will tell a story about the historical building that we're in while we're having cocktails. Before I get started, I want to thank some people that are making this happen, making this possible. First of all, our sponsor, Allie Beth Ullman. Pierce is here tonight, so thank you very much. We also have Benny Keith, Gold Crown Valet, People Newspapers, and G Texas Catering. So I'd like to thank all our sponsors for helping out. I'd also like to recognize our board. We have, I think, 12 or 13 board members here tonight, and without them, we can't get this done. So if you're one of our board members, if you could please stand up so we can recognize you. Yeah. Thank you all very much for all your help. And lastly, I want to thank the citizens of Dallas, because last year, they helped pass a bond program that is going to get us $14 million to kind of help restore the Hall of State. This building here in the Hall of State was built in 1936 for the Texas Centennial Exposition. This is kind of our way to showcase Texas to the world. And believe it or not, the person who came to help with the opening ceremony was President Roosevelt. He actually came in to do the opening ceremony. And this building is on in the Recorded Texas Historical Landmark and is also National Register Historic Places. So it's an iconic place. People around the world know about us. This Fair Park area is the largest collection of Art Deco buildings in the world. So we have something here in Dallas that's a treasure. Now with that bond package, they're going to clean up the outside of this building. They're going to do some fixes inside, which is quite a bit, but that's probably still leaves us about $10 or $15 million short, but we'll work on that. Lastly, I want to thank Laura Roosevelt. Without Laura, none of this would have happened. Laura, she is the great-granddaughter. Laura's the great-granddaughter of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, and she was born in Fort Worth and grew up in Dallas. She's an American painter with a degree in studio art and art history from Denison University and a master's from NYU. And she specializes in this abstract mixed media paintings that's known for layering techniques which lead to the observer deeper into the piece and into one's subconscious. So you've seen some of her stuff upstairs. We'll have her art up here for the next 3 weeks. So if you're around, come on by. We'll be here. Her work and collections can be found in the US, London, Bahamas, so it's kind of around the world. So with that, I'd like to introduce Ms. Laura Roosevelt.
Okay. Thank you, Carl. And thank you all for coming to this historic and memorable event tonight. I begin first by thanking Molly Nolan for her work of getting all of you here and teaching me a little bit about social media. Toby Hazelip for installing all the paintings and quotes, and Carl for your leadership in making this event happen. I must also acknowledge and send out a very special thank you to Mary Soom. The entire evening began with Mary and her interest in my abstract painting. If I'm not mistaken, it started after she saw a few of my pieces of historical pop collection while she was visiting my studio. We started talking, and the next thing I knew, we're sharing an idea of exhibiting this work at the Dallas Historical Society, maybe even creating some new pieces around the Centennial Hall and others of Eleanor. Mary quote, said to me, "Put it together and let me know what you're thinking." After she left my studio, I looked down on the coffee table, and there were two little books, one with a photo of FDR, and the other with a photo of Eleanor. These books are filled with quotes, FDR's words in one and Eleanor's in the other. Those little books were authored by my Aunt Chandler. Immediately, I thought, I have to call Chandler. Chandler and I have a very special relationship. She told me she liked my artwork, but she didn't get abstract art. She was my go-to buddy, and for those of us who knew her well, might be surprised to know she would rarely scoff or judge any of my wilder or crazy ideas. So when I called her and asked, "Chandler, what would your grandparents have said about my historic American pop paintings?" She just laughed and said, "Laura, what made you think of that?" I told her about my visit with Mary, exhibiting my work, the potential of exhibiting my work at the Dallas Historical Society, and seeing her books on my coffee table. In her very matter-of-fact manner, she said, "Well, this sounds interesting and like fun," adding, "Have you thought about asking your sister Liz? She could also help." I called Liz. Now let me tell you a little bit about my sister, Elizabeth Roosevelt Kelly. She is a recognized scholar and an expert on Eleanor Roosevelt's column, My Day. My Day was a 6-day-a-week syndicated newspaper column that Eleanor wrote from December 30th, 1935 until September 26, 1962. There is a photograph of Eleanor upstairs that Chandler felt very strongly needed to be in this exhibit. So I hope you remember it. She's at her desk late at night. But after telling Liz and about Mary, quotable Eleanor and quotable FDR, my conversation with Chandler, Liz said, "I'm in." Liz, Chandler, and I met a few times and formulated a plan. I visited the Historical Society's archives and memorabilia here in this hall and found out even more about the Roosevelts in Texas. Then we had an unexpected event in our family. On July 19th last year, in her garden, Chandler passed away. It was a major emotional setback and a deep loss. As our family gathered at Chandler's home in the days following her death, I found myself looking around the house and came upon a folder with printed photos of my historic American pop paintings and notes attached depicting quotes from FDR and Eleanor. Stunned, I realized Chandler left me a map. I let Liz know, and we went right to work. With the loss of Chandler, I couldn't help but think about losing one who knew her grandparents, traveled and spent time with them. She had heard the words and voices of both Eleanor and Franklin. I shared this with my dad. I told him about Mary Soom, quotable FDR and Eleanor, my conversations with Chandler and Liz, discovering the map, and asked him, "Dad, how many of your relatives actually heard the voices and words from your grandparents? And what would you think about having a gathering of your cousins and sharing your remembrances?" He replied, "I'm not sure if we've ever been together for that purpose, but I think it would be marvelous." Then my thoughts turned immediately to Paul Sparrow. Would he be interested and willing to partake in such a conversation? So here we are tonight, from Hyde Park to Fair Park. Paul? Thank you, Dad and Liz. But most of all, I want all those here gathered tonight to know that without Chandler, this event would have never happened. I love you, we love you, and we miss you. This is for you. Your life lives on in our memories. We see you in the sway of the grasses and the amazing Texas skies. And now I turn to Paul. It gives me great pleasure to introduce you, Paul. You gave me my first exhibit. You are a man that knows the Roosevelts. Paul is the director of the FDR Presidential Library and Museum, which is part of the National Archives. Additionally, Paul works with the Roosevelt Institute to support the library in its ongoing fundraising efforts. Before moving to the FDR Library, he was the deputy director and senior vice president for broadcasting and new media at the museum in Washington, D.C. He was a founding partner in the University of Maryland's Future of Information Alliance and a pioneer in interactive digital media. Prior to his Emmy Award-winning television, Paul was an Emmy Award-winning television producer. He began his television career at KPIX, the CBS affiliate in San Francisco. So ladies and gentlemen, let's give a great Texas welcome to Paul.
Thank you, Laura. That was very generous. I greatly appreciate it. And it's truly an honor to be here today with you, but most importantly, with these Roosevelts. I am honored to work at the library. I think it's one of America's great institutions. It was the first presidential library. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt, of course, were two of the most significant people in the 20th century, perhaps in all of American history. But they were not just figureheads and politicians and public figures. They were a father and a mother. They had a big, complicated family, and that's what we're going to learn about tonight, and what I think is some really fascinating ways. They had 5 children who survived to adulthood, 1 girl and 4 boys. The oldest was the daughter, Anna, and then James, Elliot, Franklin Jr., and Johnny, the youngest. And so tonight we have representatives of 3 of those families who will be talking to us. And like many families, like all of our families, their families were complicated. Franklin Roosevelt famously once said, "The only thing we have to fear is family reunions." And I think we can all relate to that. But we're going to start by going through and having each of the panelists tonight talk about who they are, how they fit in to the family structure, and to give you some little insight into their parents. So we'll start with Anne Roosevelt.
So my father was James, who was called Jimmy by everybody, and he was the eldest son.
That's all you want to say?
Well, I know he was very close with his brother Elliot, who came shortly behind him, and I think I'll pass it on to. Yeah, he was a good dad. Yeah.
My father was John Roosevelt. He was the baby of the family. And early on, the only, and I underline only, Republican. Other than the Theodore Roosevelt side. And I am John's eldest daughter, but second child. And Tony.
And I'm Elliot Roosevelt Jr., the namesake actually of Gramer's father, Elliot Roosevelt, who was a brother of Theodore Roosevelt. And my father was called Elliot as well, and I'm Elliot. They called me Elliot Jr., but everybody really calls me Tony. And that's what I've been known as. And my father was the second son, and later on I'll tell you how we all got to Texas.
One of the interesting things about the split between Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt was that he died in 1945. He didn't even get to see the end of World War II. And Eleanor lived until 1962. So many of her grandchildren got to know her fairly well. Now there's going to be a couple of terms tonight. I'll give you a quick glossary of locations. So the main home where Franklin Roosevelt was born and where his mother lived is called Springwood, and that's in Hyde Park, and that's right next to where the library is. Nearby, a few miles away, is what is known as Valkill, which was Eleanor Roosevelt's home, which was established first as a factory, and then some of her friends lived there, and then Eleanor lived there after Franklin died. And then there's Campobella, which is this beautiful summer cottage up in Maine, border between Canada and Maine in New Brunswick. And then they had a home in New York City, and then of course they had the White House, and they had Warm Springs, Georgia, which was a rehabilitation center for polio that FDR turned into the world's premier center for the study and rehabilitation of polio. So we're going to start with a conversation about Valkill, because it's a very, very special place, and there's a connection here with all of them. We're going to start with Nina, because she actually lived at Valkill for a period with Eleanor. So tell me a little bit about your most sort of vivid memory, and describe a little bit for everyone what Valkill is like.
Valkill, we lived in the stone cottage. So there was the furniture factory and then another smaller house called the Stone Cottage, and that's where we moved in 1950 and lived there until after my grandmother had died. It was a very special place for her because it was the only place that Eleanor Roosevelt really felt she could completely be herself. It was her home, her choice of furniture, which none of it matched, her choice of how things were run, and it was always very, very simple, very welcoming, very open. And my fondest memory of being at Valkill was I often spent the night at my grandmother's house, and there was a room adjoining hers with a bathroom in between, and that's the room that I would spend the night in. And one night I was there and I had very short, hair about here. And my grandmother came in to say goodnight, and she sat down on my bed, and she was dressed in her bathrobe, and her hair was down. She had very long, beautiful, pewter gray hair. And she brought her brush in, and she was coming in, and she sat on my bed, and I sat next to her. And we had the windows open, and we had pine trees at that time, and a big hedge that has since, been taken down or died or something, I don't know. But anyway, and the wind was blowing, and the smells of the pine and just the sounds of the evening, and my grandmother sitting there brushing her long hair. And of course, I got my brush and tried to brush my short little hair. Didn't work, but it's my fondest memory of just being with this wonderful woman who really was, at the end of the day, one of the kindest, gentlest, down-to-earth women that I was fortunate enough to know.
Nina, how old were you when you moved to Hyde Park?
I was in third grade, so I was about 8 or something.
Yeah.
And then I left Valkill when I married, many years later.
Tony, what is your fondest or most vivid memory of Grandmère?
My presence at Valkill began in 1945 when my father mustered out or got out of the service. He'd been in the Army Air Corps, and he came back to Valkill. And at Valkill, Hyde Park was really an operating farm. They had a dairy herd. They raised crops. It was about a 1,600-acre farm. And he, after FDR died, the main house, Springwood, and about, as I recall, 40 acres or something like that around it, was given to the government. But the rest of the farm remained as an operating farm. And my father sort of took over the operation of it. He had a job in New York City, so he commuted every day. But we were, my sister and younger brother and I, were here in Texas. We'll get to that a little later, perhaps. But beginning in 1945, we began to spend our summers, all summer long, my sister Chandler and I, at Hyde Park with Gromere at Valkill. We actually lived, my father lived in what is called a top cottage, which was a retreat that FDR had built. It's another stone cottage removed from Valkill. And so we lived there, and we spent every summer for 6 summers, from 1945 through the summer of 1950, when Nina moved in. We moved out. And,
Was it something she said?
no. So that was, and so and while we were there, we spent, I would say, Gromere was there a good, not every day, but she was there almost all of her time. And we had, not breakfast, but we had, most days we would have lunch and dinner with her, right there, either in the dining room or on that little porch out that overlooked the little volleyball court or whatever.
The tennis court, wait a minute.
Well, tennis court.
Tennis
okay.
court.
Okay.
So Ann, what's the memory that comes to mind for
Well,
you?
I have summer memories also. In contrast to his 3 brothers, my father went west to California. He was stationed in San Diego and Coronado during the war, and so I and my 2 brothers were born in California, and we were growing up there. So we also, other than when my grandmother would come to Los Angeles, we saw her at Valkill in the summers. And so I have some of the same sense of memories. I remember sleeping on the sleeping porch and knowing that she was in the other room close by. And there were always a bunch of cousins, bunch of girl cousins out there, and hearing the bullfrogs, and how magical and peaceful that seemed. When we would go, my 2 brothers would desert me immediately. So I remember exploring a lot by myself under the bridge and along the pond, and it was a pretty special place.
If you haven't been there to visit it, the Hudson Valley is a beautiful area. The Springwood home actually goes all the way down to the river, and the trails that FDR walked as a young boy are still there, and the woods are essentially unchanged. And when you get up to the Valkill, there's this beautiful pond. Valkill actually means river stream, right?
Right.
And it runs right through the property, and it's really quite beautiful. So, Tony, you've been hinting at it twice, so we'll get right to this question. The most important question of the night. He said, Paul, if you ask one question, make damn sure you ask this one. Yeah. So, Tony, how did you become a Texan?
All right. Okay. My father, at age 22 in 1932, came to Fort Worth. He'd always had an abiding interest in the emerging aviation industry. It wasn't really an industry at that point, but flying and aviation. And he had a really serious interest in that, such that, and I don't know to whom he had expressed it, but he was an aviation editor at age 22 for the Hearst newspapers. And so the paper sent him to Fort Worth to interview a man who had started a fledgling little airline called American Airways, C.R. Smith. And so he came to Fort Worth, met Mr. Smith, and during that visit, there was a party actually at the Adolphus Hotel here in Dallas. My mother was present. She had been born. Her father had come to Fort Worth. He had worked for Mr. Swift in Chicago, and Mr. Swift sent him in 1902 to Texas to build packing plants in Texas for Swift and Company. She was born in Fort Worth in 1910. She was at that party that evening. They met, and they were married a short time later. And so all of my sister and I and younger brother were all born in Fort Worth and raised in Fort Worth.
Now, all 4 of the boys served in uniform during World War II. James, who was the oldest, had really serious combat experience. Now, I'm sure none of you are familiar with the idea that presidential children come under unusual scrutiny from the press, particularly ones that have semi-official roles within the White House as consultants or advisors or hostesses. And I want you to talk about James for a minute, because he was a Marine and a commando, and really there was no coddling because he was the president's son. Talk a little bit about his military career, and then I know both of you have stories too.
We were talking about this some at lunch today. He was a Marine. He was part of Carlson's Raiders. It was such an important time in his life because obviously if you're part of the president's family, it's a certain kind of bubble that you're living in. But when you're out there in combat, you're in that. And I think it was a very important time of his life. He did serve in the Pacific. He also had some other missions in other parts of the world. As many of you probably have experienced, soldiers in World War II, they didn't so much share their experiences. They didn't talk about it. Daddy never talked about it to us. But when, at the end of his life, when he was ill with Parkinson's, he relived every battle.
Really?
And that is how he, that was his consciousness at the end of his life, was of being in the war.
He was involved in the battles around Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands on some really horrific jungle warfare.
He was shot down, wasn't he?
No.
Oh, that was Elliot.
So John was the youngest. So he didn't get into the war till late.
Well, I don't know how late. I know that he was in the Pacific and he and Uncle Franklin were serving in the Navy. They were the only two in the Navy. And I know that one of my father, he was on a destroyer, and that was sunk. And the only thing he ever really talked about, he didn't, like Uncle Jimmy, he didn't really share much with us. We know that he was shot and had a lot of shrapnel in one of his legs. And the only thing he ever said was, "Oh, well, I ended up in the drink." And that's all he said, really. So, and he never really did talk about his experience, but with later understanding, I really do believe that the war had a tremendous impact on him and how he viewed the world afterwards.
Now, Tony, your father's early aviation experience came into effect in the war.
Yeah, my father joined the service in 1940. I think he was the first of the boys to join the service. And again, he was interested in flying, but his eyesight kept him from being a pilot, at least at the outset. And his first deployment was to look for a different ferry base for the transfer of planes from the United States to England. And the Gander was not considered to be a good option because presumably, at least I've heard, that they felt that it was too close to the ocean and it was too vulnerable for shelling by German warships. So they were looking for a base that would be further inland and more remote and protected. And so he got involved in reconnaissance work at that point and stayed in reconnaissance throughout the war. They settled, as a matter of fact, on a place that's still in operation today called Goose Bay. And that was the principal ferry point. After that deployment, he came back and prepared for Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And he went all the way through the invasion of North Africa, and then the invasion of Sicily and Italy, and on up in preparation for the Normandy invasion. So he went in 40 and got out in 1945. In my mind, there's no question, but that was he probably had greater traction, if you will, as a military person than any other period of his life. I personally think that he should have made a career of the military, but he chose not to.
Now, the Roosevelts, obviously, most famous couple. Eleanor, she was voted the most respected woman in America for 20 years in a row or something. When you're a kid, you don't fully understand the dynamics of celebrity. When was the first time you really became aware of the fact that your family was a little different? And what is the most interesting story you can talk about being a Roosevelt and what that attention means?
Well, there are a lot of stories. I'm sure we all have lots of experiences that are different. Some of my earliest memories of her, couldn't have been more than 4, and I remember her visiting us in California and my not understanding that she was somehow a special person. I thought she was there to see me, and what were all these other people doing here? And so I was just talking, and she was just so kind. She, listened. She turned to me and listened, and everybody was hovering. But I grew up in Southern California, and I remember as a second grader hearing other kids in the school talk about my grandmother, and they called her Pink. And I knew she liked blue. I thought she liked blue. So I didn't understand what they were meaning. But I understood it was, you didn't, people, how did they didn't even know my grandmother. How could they be talking? So that was when I started to realize that this was different.
It's interesting. I have a similar, I was born in California actually because Daddy was in the Navy. But
in the same town that we lived in.
That's right, right. But so my first thing that I had a name that was of not so much of note, but I had a good friend in kindergarten, first grade, and I wasn't allowed in her house. And it was because I had this funny last name. So I thought, it didn't bother me. I didn't think anything of it. And then shortly after that, we moved to Hyde Park. And I thought that the name was like Smith. I mean, everybody I knew had the same last name that I had. So what did I know? And I just wasn't, I think I was pretty, out to lunch, probably still am maybe. But the first time I really got it, I was in Iran with my grandmother, and we were on our way, and my Aunt Anna, we were on our way to Persepolis, and we stopped in the middle of the desert. There's nothing around. We hadn't gotten to Persepolis yet. And there's a hut, and a beggar man was living in this hut, and our guide told us that it was common to stop and then say hello to him. So, but Roosevelts are big on picnics, so we had a big picnic with us. And so we stopped to pay homage to this gentleman in the desert, and he was blind. He couldn't see anything. He had no radio, no television. He didn't have any communication, really, and not that many people drove in those days. This was like 1956 or something, off to Persepolis. They would go in big buses or something, and they wouldn't stop. So he really had very little contact with the outside world. We got there, and he's kneeling in front of his hut. We get out of the car, and we come over, and my grandmother says to him, "We have a picnic. We would like to share it with you." And suddenly this man, with tears in his eyes, on the ground, grabs Gramer's skirt and says, "Mrs. Roosevelt, you've come to visit me." Mm-hmm. And I realized she was a famous person.
Wow.
Well, I don't think I recognized it right off the bat, but I wasn't too old before I realized that with all of these young Secret Service men around me, nobody had playmates like I did. And that was really marvelous. We lived on a ranch out west of Fort Worth, and there were, kids would come out and play from time to time, but we were out there pretty much by ourselves, and these young men were just great. We did all kinds of things together. They made things for me. They whittled things for me. We would go down to the creek, and they would take their pistols out and shoot at rocks and whatnot. It was just all great sport. And when I got to the point where I was going to first grade, at recess time, we had a kind of a recess area, and there were two gates in the chain link fence, and there was always a Secret Service man standing in each gate, and I thought that was pretty special.
Well, now if you've seen the exhibit right in the front, there's a photograph of a woman and 3 children, and one of them, the youngest, is sitting on Franklin's lap. Would you talk about that photograph a little bit and what you remember about that?
Well, I was christened at the White House, so I think that first picture was taken probably in 19, I don't remember when it would have been taken, but I was just an infant, and I was born in 1936, so it was on the occasion. And then there's the other picture that was taken of a lot of the grandchildren together at the time of the 1945 inauguration at the White House, and we were all seated, and my younger brother, and that photograph is seated on FDR's lap. Yeah, but
being in the White House during World War II must have been quite a...
Well, again, it was great fun. We slide down the banister, and they had a big barrel, I remember, that was full of peanuts, and you could get them and feed them to the squirrels. And, we were, we were youngsters. We were having a good time and playing a lot. I remember on the occasions we visited Hyde Park, it was before the advent of air travel when we were young, and so traveling from Texas to Washington or New York was always by train, always through St. Louis. That seemed to be where all the train traffic hub was. And we'd stay at the big house, Springwood, and we always stayed on the 3rd floor. That was kind of a big playroom, as I recall. And I recall years later, after Joanne and I were married, going back, and that crib was still there, and the same blanket was on the crib.
They were frugal.
Yeah.
So Nina, this is a question for you. You told me this story, and I find it very endearing. So Eleanor Roosevelt may have been accused of being a pinko, but she was actually a fairly harsh critic of the Soviet Union, although she acknowledged that they did some things better than the United States did, particularly in the way they cultivated international alliances. Eleanor had traveled to the Soviet Union, had gotten into a fairly public fight with Premier Nikita Khrushchev. And in 1959, Khrushchev comes to the United States, the first time a Soviet leader had come. He goes to Washington, visits President Eisenhower, goes to New York. There's a big hullabaloo in New York at the United Nations, and then something to do with a shoe, you may have heard about it. And then he comes up to Hyde Park to pay his respects. And so what happened the night before?
Oh, it wasn't even the night before. Okay, Khrushchev was coming, and we were all my mother was really excited because she thought, good, we'll be really nice to him and then he won't bomb us. So that was her attitude. So we're making these huge preparations because they were supposed to, initially they were going to come for lunch. No, they had to come for breakfast. So Grandmère brought from New York lots of pastries and things like that, and Marge Entrup, who was my grandmother's cook at the time, she made all sorts of dishes and baked all kinds of breads and pastries and muffins and all kinds of stuff. Just tons of food. And at 6 o'clock in the morning of the day they were coming, the phone in our house in Stone Cottage rang, and it was my grandmother. And she called my father, and she said, "John, I've just been told that the Russians want vodka with their breakfast. We have to get vodka." Well, we didn't have vodka, so Daddy called the man who was kind of the superintendent of the farm at that time, Charlie Kernan, and said, "Charlie, we've got to find some vodka." And so they managed to get the name of the man who owned the liquor store in Hyde Park, and they finally managed to get him to open up so they could run and buy some vodka and bring it. So they brought it over, so there was vodka. Well, the entire Russian entourage came, and they had these huge, long limousines. And if you ever go to Valkill, there is not a lot of room for cars to turn around, and particularly big, long, stretch limousines. And so there was this mad sort of traffic jam in the middle of the driveway, and everybody's trying to leave because suddenly they arrived, and then suddenly they had to leave because they were now, had to go to the library to put a wreath on FDR's grave. So they hadn't really had time to eat many of these lovely pastries. So Khrushchev grabs one of them, and then he races out the door, and he gets to his limousine, and he takes the pastry and goes, "One for the road." He gets in his car, and off they go.
That story is a precursor to one of my favorite photographs. It's right outside my office, and it shows Premier Khrushchev and his big entourage and Eleanor Roosevelt in the library. And Eleanor sort of has her back to the camera, and she's hunched over, the only woman in the picture. And she has her hand up so that you know she is lecturing the premier of the Soviet Union. And right next to the premier, there's a young man with dark hair who's sort of leaning forward, listening to what Mrs. Roosevelt is saying, knowing he's about to have to translate it to the most dangerous man in the world, with an expression on his face like, "I hope he doesn't know where my parents live." She brooked no quarters with anyone. So Anna, this is a question for you, and it's a little tricky, but it's about misconceptions. Famous families, a narrative evolves around them, and then people think they know everything there is to know about that family. For you, what's the biggest misconception you think that's out there about the family that you would like to see corrected?
Well, I find that people do think of our grandparents as sort of superhuman. And I can understand how they might get there, but that is a misconception. They were just human beings with complicated lives, and also just sort of basic, regular folks. And I think that I would like more people to understand how like us they were, and that's the thing about America, is that just like, we elect from our own. And that we don't have these divine people as our leaders. We have us as our leaders. And so that is always impressive to me. And people don't actually want to hear often that they were really just, very much like you.
Government is us.
Government is us, and not
said.
an alien power over us.
And Nina, how about you?
Oh, Anna said it perfectly. I agree with her. That they really were, and particularly my grandmother. I just see her as a complex, and yet, as Anne described it, their biggest joy was to be able to connect with other people, and they felt like others. They didn't feel different from, in that sense.
Tony, you have a different take on it? Or?
Perhaps. I think a lot of people think that that Eleanor and Franklin's children led an idyllic life and upbringing. And I think that was far from the truth. I think they had two parents who were pretty much preoccupied with their own interests, their own undertakings. And I think those children, particularly the boys, I think, grew up in an environment where they were, when they got a little older, perhaps in teenagers or late teenagers and in their 20s, you know, people were solicitous, fawning. I think it led them to think that they were perhaps a little special, and I think that that did not serve them well in the long term. Mm-hmm. So I think that people really don't understand the difficulty that those kiddos had in growing up and maturing and trying to be productive parents and individuals.
It's interesting. One of the three children that Anna, the oldest daughter, had, there was Ellie or Sisty and Curtis. Sisty and Busty were the two kids that ran around the White House in the early years, and then John Bottinger a little bit later. But Curtis wrote a book about, what's it called, Brighter Than the Sun? Or
No, wait a minute. Too close to the sun.
Yeah. Right. And it talks about the impact of growing up under this microscope and the impact it had on the children, because everything you do is on the front page of the newspaper tomorrow, and it was difficult. But I think many historians say we live in a world today created by the Roosevelts. Yeah. If you think about everything from Social Security and minimum wage, a 40-hour work week, labor unions, the United Nations, international treaties.
This building,
the thousands of buildings all across America built. And yet there's so much. If you had just one legacy that you were going to pick out, what would it be?
for me, it is their total commitment to democracy. The theory and the practice. When I reread speeches, each of them spoke almost every time about democracy and what it means to live in one. And to me, that's the thing that has meant the most to me in how I've pursued my own life.
And of course, in World War II, literally democracy, the future of democracy was at stake.
At stake.
How about you?
I would sort of ditto what Anna said, and I would add that Grandmère, I know because I follow her around various picnics and when she would have a lot of people around, and she was always talking about our responsibility as citizens of our democracy, and that for people newly coming to the United States, she was adamant about them learning as much as they could, as quickly as they could, to be part of their communities and not to really understand how their communities worked, how their government worked, and the protection of democracy through its institutions. And the other thing that I, as for legacy, that has always sort of resonated with me, and I've hopefully tried to pass it on to my children, is the ability to really listen, even though you might not agree right away, but to listen to, and listening not just to hear it, but to really take it in and try and understand and empathize, if you will, with what another person was saying. And to me, that is even the basis of how the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came about. It was her ability to work with people from completely different cultures and backgrounds. But instead of letting that get in her way, she managed to figure out how to tweak words so that we can come to an understanding. And it's not that we totally agree or we embrace it or whatever, but we get it, kind of in vernacular terms, and we understand. And I think, to me, if part of the legacy is to have us, as a country, continue that kind of interaction.
Yeah, that's... Tony?
Well, Yes. When I think of FDR's legacy, I think two things. First of all, he was the progenitor of the first really safety net, if you will, for a broad segment of our population. Now, people can argue it's gone way too far in some respects, perhaps, but he was the one who started the whole sort of concept of government has got to take care of those who need it the most. And secondly, I think he certainly was the savior. He and Winston Churchill, and perhaps Mr. Stalin too, but he and Winston Churchill together were certainly the saviors of Europe, and perhaps the United States. We don't know, but there's no question of what he preserved Western Europe.
Yeah.
And that whole history and civilization as it existed.
Well, we're going to try to have time for some questions in a few minutes, but I'm going to ask one more question about the panel, because there are two branches of the family. So the Roosevelts first came to New York around 1650, and in the 1700s they split. One wing went out to Long Island, and one wing went up to Hudson Valley. The Long Island Oyster Bay wing produced Teddy Roosevelt, and the Hudson Valley wing produced Franklin Roosevelt. And they sort of divided as the Long Islanders were Republicans and the Hudson Valleyans were Democrats. And that stayed pretty true up until after the war, and then things changed a little bit internally with the family. Several of the boys in the 1952 election just supported Eisenhower.
Right.
So let's start with you, Tony. Talk a little bit about the political dynamics within the family around Democrats and Republicans, and how people were surprised when when Franklin Roosevelt started supporting Republicans.
Yeah, well, I can just speak to it a little bit from my father's perspective. He was a devoted Democrat until I think Eisenhower came along, and in fact he tried to convince Mr. Eisenhower, Dwight Eisenhower, to run for the presidency as a Democrat, and was not successful. And as a Republican candidate, my father supported him. And interestingly, my father later on lived in Scottsdale, Arizona, and he and Barry Goldwater became, of all things, very, very close friends, which was
Strange bedfellows.
Strange bedfellows. They really were. But I attribute some of that to the fact that Barry Goldwater, had also served in the Army Air Corps, and I think that they shared that experience, which drew them together. But I would say that my father predominantly was a Democrat throughout his whole life, with perhaps the exception. And I'll tell you a funny story. When Gromere passed away in 1962, and her funeral was at Hyde Park, there were three presidents who were present at the funeral, and President Kennedy was then president. But we also had President Eisenhower there, and President Truman there. And Nina's father, being the outspoken Republican that he was, President Kennedy went over to John and said, "John, would you please preoccupy Ike? If you don't, he's going to come over here and tell me how I should run the presidency."
How about you, Nina?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, my father, I never knew him to be a Democrat, which made the table conversations when Uncle Franklin was there, or even when Uncle Elliot would visit or something. But Uncle Franklin and Daddy in particular, they would just, with Gromere, they would just go at it at the Christmas table, Thanksgiving dinner table, whenever. But it was always hysterical because Roosevelts tend to have big booming, particularly the men, big booming voices. So, and Gromere would just sort of sit there and smile. So I guess as a kid, my parents tried to bribe me to vote Republican at one particular time, and I just looked at him and said, "I'm not telling you who I'm going to vote for." So I mean, my brother and I just sort of grew up figuring that we could do whatever way we thought, and that was the nice thing, because you could have these, wild arguments, and you learned a lot. And so it was really, I'm glad that there was a diversity of opinions within the family.
We need more of that, don't we?
Yes.
Yeah. So my dad was always he was a Democrat. He ran for office. He was a 6-term congressman from Los Angeles. He ran as a Democrat for governor before that, and as a Democrat for mayor of Los Angeles. So he was very active in Democratic politics, and he stuck with Adlai in 52.
He did.
And probably, I suspect that was that Gramer had a lot to do with.
Oh, I'm sure.
With that.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Adlai Stevenson was her candidate.
Yep.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Later in life, and actually earlier, he had been friends with Ronald Reagan when they were both in the film industry for my dad a brief time, and he liked Ronald Reagan.
I'll tell you another little story. When I was, I went left and went back to Andover for the last 2 years of high school, and I would come down to Hyde Park and visit on occasion. And on one of those occasions, I guess we're having lunch with Gramer, and Gramer said, "Tony, do you consider yourself a Democrat or Republican?" And I said, "I think I'm probably an independent." She went ballistic. She said, "You cannot be effective at all as an independent." She said, "Just choose which party and get in there, and if you don't like what they espouse, then try to change it. But you can't be an independent."
I think, do we want to try to go to the audience questions? How are we for time? Well, we have a microphone back here. If you have a question, raise your hand, and we'll bring a microphone over to you. I see one back there. Here we go.
Thank you so much. Is it? Okay. Thank you so much for being here. And I have more of a comment that when I was a little kid, I got to go to Warm Springs. And that was just an amazing trip, and it stuck with me for many years. And the biggest memory I have are the car, because that was just the coolest thing to see, this modified car for the first time, which is maybe not so uncommon now, but then it was. And then the bathtub. I have always thought there's in the bathtub, if you've never seen it, if you drop the soap, there's a little ramp. So the soap comes right back to you if you're the president and you're not maybe as mobile. It's just right there. And I've always thought that was just all tubs should be that way because everybody drops the soap. So can you please tell us who the photos are?
Sure. The one on the far left is Chandler, the one that Laura was talking about, her aunt. And who's the one?
That's Frank.
This is Frank.
Frank III.
This is Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt III, Frank, we call him. And he was going to be here tonight, but he has a knee that is about to be replaced and begged off. But I might say that in the program, there are two little inserts, I think. One is a really marvelous piece that was written fairly recently by Johnny Bodiger, who is Anna's son. And it's called The Spirit of Eleanor Roosevelt. And it's really a marvelous piece. And it's newly minted by Johnny. Not for this occasion, but it just happened to be. And the other one is some notes that Frank was able to dig up from a talk that he was a professor at Sarah Lawrence for many years, a professor of economics. And he gave a talk about his relationship with Eleanor Roosevelt several years ago, and these are the notes that we reproduced that he had from that talk.
We have a question right down here.
Yeah, so...
wait for the microphone so everyone can hear you.
Thank you. So we have like the Kennedys, and there's still Kennedys in office and running for office. You had like the Bushes. Was there ever a consideration there would be like a Roosevelt political dynasty that would carry on the mantle of FDR and Eleanor?
You should take that.
Not from this quarter.
Not from this quarter, but this quarter.
Well, I would,
Put you on the
I would
spot.
say one of the things that is different in our family is I don't know that any of us were ever, pushed or expected to run for office. We were expected to be citizens. We were expected to take that seriously and to get involved in our community and to be politically active, to be effective.
Right.
Choose a side and do it. My brother has run for office, but in general, I've been involved in politics pretty much all my life, but not as a candidate.
Do we have another question? I'm going to ask one more then while we're waiting. Oh, do we have one question over here? Go ahead.
Yes, I just wondered if you could share with us some of your memories of FDR himself.
Over to you.
There you go, Tony.
Well, I was so young. I was only 8 years old when FDR died, and living in Texas, and we were only back around Hyde Park and the White House on special occasions, really, while he was living. So, and when I was there during, say, Christmas holiday or Thanksgiving or something like that, he was so preoccupied. We saw very little of him. My recollection is that, personal recollection is that we would maybe see him in the evening before we went to bed. But I have very, very little personal recollection of FDR. I spent, all those years at Valkill with our grandmother, so we got to know her very well. And like others have said, after Joanne and I were married, Grandmère would come to visit us in our home after we were married. So I knew her. We knew her very well, but I didn't really know FDR.
I was only 2, so I didn't know him either. So.
You were.
And I was minus.
So if you had to choose one story to pass down to the next generation, what would that one story be?
I would probably repeat this story about Tony. What do you consider yourself to be, a Democrat or Republican? And say, you need to get involved.
Yeah, you need to.
That's classic Eleanor. Nina?
I have so many. I don't know. It's really hard. I think I would probably just talk about my grandmother as a grandmother, and a woman who took seriously her role in her country and her vision of what she viewed for the greatness of her country and her sense of duty. I really haven't told a lot of stories to the kids because they get kind of, yeah, so what, But, and I just have lots of them because I spent a lot of time traveling and then just day-to-day kinds of things. So I don't have really, something specific that I would really pass on to them except kind of who she was. And that's what, for me, I want, if I ever talk about her, I want people to realize that she was a true person who cared deeply about the individuals who make up this great country, and she wanted it always to go forward.
And you get the last word.
Well, I have shared with my children something that you actually mentioned, Nina, that was very important to me in my experience with my grandmother, and that was her ability to listen and to truly listen, not to be thinking about what her answer was or what she was going to say, but to really listen to what I was saying. And as a small child, I remember being impressed by that and how important that was to me and my sense of myself, how it made me feel like I had to think and I had to have thoughts and I had to, I was worth something. And if it can have that impact on me, can I convey that to anyone else who I have the opportunity to listen to? And that has been important to me, and so I've shared that with my kids.
Well, I think they said this repeatedly on their radio broadcast and in her daily column. Write to us. Tell us what you think. And they created a conversation between the presidency and the American public that no president or first lady had before. And I do think that goes to the key point there, which is that they really cared what Americans said, and they listened. And we have about 2 million letters to Eleanor Roosevelt and an equal number to FDR at the library if you want to come and read them. Just go to New York, turn left, 2 hours straight up the river. You can't miss it. Thank you very much. Can we have a round of applause for this fantastic panel?
Thank you very much, Paul. Thank the family. We're glad to have you all here. It was a very special treat, and we invite you all back that are not from Texas back here anytime. Thank you. All right. Thank you all for coming out tonight, and we'll be doing programming like this going forward, so just kind of keep your eye on what we're doing, and hopefully you can join and find out. Thank you all very much.